Kia ora, good evening, I'm Neil Walker. Welcome to Inside New Zealand. Around the world, people are celebrating a century of cinema. It's 100 years since Louis Lumiere first publicly projected moving images, while here in New Zealand, Mr. A.H. Whitehouse created a stir in Auckland with a peep show device called an Edison kinescope. As part of our celebration of the centenary of film, acclaimed Kiwi actor Sam Neill has come home to make a film about New Zealand cinema and the industry which has recently taken the world by storm with films like The Piano, Heavenly Creatures and Once Were Warriors. Sam calls it a cinema of unease.
I am an expatriate. Like all those who are separated from their country, I dream of home. I dream of New Zealand. This is what I imagine when I'm away. This lonely place. Why this particular spot? Possibly because of its magical silence, its haunting emptiness. I've been up and down this road many times before and never seen, never heard another car, another living soul. Or perhaps it might be that now that we've produced a national cinema in this country in the last 15 years or so, I now have a permit to dream cinematic images that are of our own place. And this is my place. This road has served as the central image in New Zealand film. Not just because people in our films are usually on some journey or other, escaping somewhere, moving on, but it also seems to me that this lonely road through this indifferent landscape, this isolated space, is the story of cinema in New Zealand itself. And so I leave for New Zealand. I'm going home to explore New Zealand cinema. It seems to me from this distance that film in New Zealand has made a quantum leap in the past 3 or 4 years. Is this true? In a sense, every time I return to New Zealand, it's a return to my childhood. It's a journey I've made many times before. The first time, however, was not by plane. In the mid-1950s, we returned home on the Rangatiki, 17,000 tons and the flagship of the New Zealand Shipping Company. 4 weeks at sea, 12,000 miles to the furthest place on Earth, I was going to New Zealand to grow up. I spent most of the journey at the back of the ship in isolation, a lonely red lump of mumps. We had to travel from here all the way around to here. I was hoping it might be this big sunny lump here, but no, it was these little scrag ends here. I asked my father if there are any kangaroos there, and he said, no, don't be bloody silly, so that was that. There are, however, 55 million sheep here, but I've never thought that's much of a compensation.
In the window, the one with the waggly tail. How much is that doggy in the window? Oh, go on. I do hope that dog is for sale.
We arrived in Littleton, I was 7 years old, a settler in a new land. Dad's grim and ancient Uncle Red met us and took us for a wild drive around the Port Hills in his Vauxhall Velox. This was my first view of New Zealand. It seemed bright and rather barren. Where were the trees? I was sick. These days, whenever I come back, I never fail to be air, the space, blue sky down to your feet. And I just can't wait to hit the road. Find the gears.
Donaldo, what a coincidence. I mean, bumping into you like this. We need someone who can show us where to get a good feed. Besides...
We rented this little house for a year or so in Cashmere, a virtually comatose dormitory suburb of Christchurch. Soap car races down these steep streets were what we found most engaging as kids.
Master Tantrum wins by half a trolley length from his opponent and is wheeled away in triumph to receive the first prize, which is a choice between a free trip to Australia or a scholarship. He accepted the scholarship.
Better to keep moving because only a year before, less than a mile up that road, a murder had been committed. A murder that haunted even our daytime thoughts. In broad daylight, 2 adolescent girls had murdered one of their mothers in a park. So here we were, marooned in 1950s New Zealand. Life in Christchurch then seemed suffocatingly dull. Once a week, however, things were different. Every Saturday morning, I'd whiz along here to the Chums Club on Riccarton Road. 2 hours of bliss, cartoons, contests, and the sort of one-reeler serial that would inspire Lucas and Spielberg years later.
Yeah, it's Milo Scott. I'll give you just 1 second to start talking.
This is a Jaffa. It's a delicious orange and chocolate sweet. But here at the Rex, now sadly a pie shop, it was the weapon of choice.
Hey, piss off!
Thrown with sufficient force, one of these could put a pretty good dent in another chum's head, usually mine. I took great exception to this Philistine behavior. I seemed to be the only one who wanted... And besides, I was in love with the flicks.
A large crowd came to the Wellington opening of Britain's new colour film on Scott's fateful last journey to the South Pole.
It wasn't just me. All New Zealanders loved the movies. It was the night out. Television was still in the future.
On the average, New Zealanders go to the pictures 20 times a year.
Movies kept us in touch with the world. They solved the pain of isolation. We could pretend we were plugged in to what was happening in London or New York. This is the centre of Christchurch, Cathedral Square, and all the cinemas were here. The Avon and the Regent, which are still there, where they showed the posh stuff from England. Tivoli was over there. And in that corner there, the most dangerous spot in town, the Crystal Palace, where they showed the more louche stuff, horror films, more alarmingly, rock and roll films, and anything at all with Jane Mansfield. Forbidden cinematic fruit and just the sort of thing we wanted to see. As a result, the Teddy Boys and Bodgies, looking as close to Brando or Gene Vincent as possible with their bikes and bombs, hung out here. This phenomenon, youth culture in imitation of what we saw on the screen from elsewhere, was viewed with the greatest apprehension by the honest citizens of Christchurch, and something very interesting was done about it, in the interests of law and order. Unofficially, of all things, the army was brought in. Truckloads of conscripts were quietly trucked in here one Friday night with orders to beat the shit out of anyone who didn't look exactly 4 square, which they did. Cathedral Square was safe again, and New Zealand a duller place for it.
That be polished.
Whiter, brighter, cleaner.
Look at this. It's an inch thick. You'll have to do the silver. I polished it last week. And the grapes need cleaning.
Once a month or so they do it.
Oh, I just mowed the lawn. Does this look like a well-maintained frontage?
Very often after drying the dishes.
In America, the 50s seem to represent, for filmmakers, a comforting return to a more innocent past. In New Zealand, by contrast, the view of the 50s seems to be less nostalgic, more a source of horror or madness. This is Sunnyside Psychiatric Hospital. If we were really brave, this is the road that we take to school, risking some kind of psychic infection. Everyone seemed to know someone who'd ended up here. It was a paranoid time in New Zealand. People were afraid of communism, of trade unions, of the yellow peril, of rock and roll. As a result, it was rigorously conformist, politically conservative, and socially dull. But my memory tells me that the greatest fear of all was of madness. Paradoxically, for many, the only way out. For my own family, a landscape to which we would often flee. My parents to fish, my brother and sister and I to go feral.
But there's just time for the hardy ones to go for a swim before lunch, and down to the lakeside they go. It's only ice water from the mountains.
A landscape that I've loved ever since. Stop this. See, as New Zealanders, we have this impulse. Give us a box brownie and we have to make everything picturesque. And this is it. Rather grim and as determinedly English as possible from the other side of the world. And with luck on a Saturday night in the dining hall, a boy called Rutherford would project movies onto an old sheet, oblivious to the jeers as he changed the reels. On the screen, we watched determined English actors offering stiff resistance to the Hun. It seems amazing to me now that all our heroes had foreign accents, that all the adventures happened somewhere else in the world. There was no one we recognized, no play screen. New Zealand cinema in a fictional sense did not exist. The most we'd get would be rugby if we were lucky. Before the real thing. And the real thing, of course, was from overseas.
Douglas, when you finish making love to Sally, what are you up to on Monday?
Making love to Sally, I hope.
Richardson and I are flying over to the Reading Aero Club. Care to join up?
Yep, copy in.
The architecture of a place like this speaks volumes, full of affection and longing for somewhere else. In this case, a mythical England, where things are supposedly older and better than here, where people spoke properly, smoked de Maurier from silver cases, and inherited impeccably cut tweed jackets. We all wanted to go there. And eventually we all did, and it was nothing like that. It was full of skinheads and train strikes and page 3 girls in tabloids. But that's another story. There's a touching pretense about buildings like this. They pretend to be somewhere else. This is the most brilliant example of what I'm talking about. This half-timbered, rose-gardened vision of Stratford-on-Avon. Houses of all things, thermal pools, sinister, sulphurous South Seas mud baths. These are the buildings of exiles. Exiles of empire. The British Empire stood for order, enlightenment, decency, and sacrifice. And such sacrifice.
I reckon you can put up with anything if you've got good mates. And I've got the best. It's funny being in one of the oldest countries in the world and coming from one of the youngest. Don't know why, but I think about it a lot. Tell Mum not to worry.
This little place, one shop, a couple of dozen houses, has a surprising name of Middlemarch. George Eliot might be a little lost here. And over here, like every little place like this, is the War Memorial. And look how many men have died here. Amazing, really. And as far from Middlemarch as they could possibly.
Funny this coming after the telegram.
Play fully with Tony.
Just a swinging stride of for the biggest job ever tackled. Because as things are, only soldiers and fighters can make the world safe for civilians to live in. Safe for women and children and decent, ordinary people.
What did they die for? King, country, the sanctity of certain European borders. Nearly 29,000 New Zealand men lost their lives for the British Empire. Lambs to the slaughter. The empire became the Commonwealth. It sounded more acceptable, a brotherhood of nations. No matter that our brothers in Asia and Africa were jumping ship as fast as they possibly could, we would stick by Britain. They would stick by us, no matter what. We would do our duty, and our duty was to produce cheap food for home. And how many sheep lost their lives to the British Empire, one wonders? Well, I can tell you, 340 million sheep were raised here, slaughtered, sent to Britain at basement prices, and converted into overcooked Sunday roasts. Then in 1973, Britain joined the common market without so much as a thank you very much. It was a betrayal of breathtaking indifference. Our very reason for existence had gone. We felt abandoned and incredibly stupid. It was time to grow up. What we needed was a sense of ourselves, a culture of our own.
I trust that I have made it clear. Shall alone have the right and the power to buy land from now the owners.
Maori, of course, had already been betrayed. He'd Maori rights to their lands and fisheries. 20 years of subsequent warfare made it abundantly clear that that was not what was meant at all.
Are they no maramara?
Why? They're our friends.
shall perish.
This is still central to the Maori sense of grievance.
It's the time, Mr. Wolfe.
There's still, to an extent, of people who feel angry, marginalized, and dislocated.
This is God's house.
I am one of God's children.
Two people, betrayed, living uneasily side by side in paradise.
give you a loaded gun? Of course I would.
I have never in my life seen anything in the same category.
Saw The Third Man, and the best film ever made, Notorious. This is the Century, a brilliant theatre where cinema warfare reached new heights. Unlike the Rex, this had an upstairs, so if you could only afford the 1 and 9s downstairs, you were likely to receive an ice cream down your neck, thrown with tremendous velocity from a great height. Afterwards, I'd stumble out of here, blinking in the sunlight, and I was James Mason or Bill Holden for about 5 minutes, but it never occurred to me for a second that I myself might be on the screen one day. What we saw implicitly carried the message that because we were somehow strangely absent from the screen, that our own culture was somehow unworthy and we ourselves were less than worthwhile.
Earliest days of cinema. But these were moments of lonely effort by a few brave individuals, and they seldom gained a receptive audience. Rudel Hayward made several feature films, starting in the 1920s.
And then in 1952, that other great pioneer, John O'Shea, founded Pacific Films in this little place.
Ah, thanks.
Going by?
Oh, just down into the Hokianga.
The Hokianga is a big place. But everything is small there.
Everything? Some car.
It's not much of a place, the Hokianga. Sometimes I like it. More than any other part of the country. But I hate the mud flats and the shabby little houses. And I hate the sand hills.
Is it all sand?
Miles and miles of sand.
Just down the road from Pacific Films is the old National.
It was a strange place, but at least I'd found others who also wanted to find out what happened
In
next.
the editing room, the film is first viewed in the moviola and is then cut into sequences of the required length and arranged in bins in the correct order for the proposed picture.
The great thing about working at the film unit was you could take 3 or 4 years to make a documentary, and many people did.
Its function was primarily to produce picturesque short films of an uplifting nature designed to convince people at home and abroad that this was indeed God's own country. The unit's apotheosis was a 3-screen saga called This Is New Zealand. For the first time in my experience, people queued for a New Zealand film. Audiences wept at the splendor of their own land and shed tears to think how lucky they were.
Ironically, while the film unit was producing propaganda, selling the idea of a beautiful, ideal little country, it, along with Pacific, was training directors who would later turn this idea on its head.
People like John Lang.
You've gone, Max.
Paul Maunder, Barry Barclay, John Reed.
You can come out now.
Filmmakers who would produce work which was much less sunny than the accepted National Film Unit line.
Come on, for Christ's sake! Nothing will happen to you!
But... Please.
They would turn their backs on the picturesque. They
In my early days at the National Film Unit, I cut a short film for Paul Maunder, and it was shown here first at the Wellington Film Festival.
Come on, Theo!
Come on and bark a little! We won't hurt you!
As the titles rolled, a drunk behind me yelled, "Don't tell me this bastard's from New Zealand!" This witticism was greeted with much hilarity, which was sustained until the end of the film. It was Chum's Club all over again. The ridiculous Fassbinder which followed was watched, by contrast, with great solemnity. I tell this story because it gives a little insight into the less than encouraging milieu at the time for a possible feature film industry here.
Listen, I haven't bloody left yet, so shift that heap. Hang on a minute. Look, I just want to talk to you. Stand, please, for God's sake.
And then suddenly, in 1977, everything began to change. For film in New Zealand, and for me. For reasons that still elude me, Roger Donaldson and Ian Mune cast me as the lead in the first commercial feature film made in New Zealand for 15 years or so, Sleeping Dogs. It's a dark, rather uneven film about a man running in a futuristic and authoritarian New Zealand. People understood what the film was saying, it found an audience in New Zealand, and was a success. 4 feature films quickly followed, and suddenly, we had a film industry. The most famous scene in Sleeping Dogs, a scene that embedded itself into the national consciousness, is very curious and prescient. In the back streets of Auckland, the special police beat a crowd demonstrating against an oppressive As the batons found their targets, people were saying, "It's just like Sleeping Dogs."
Right? That was used to weigh down Harvey's body.
The police also star in Beyond Reasonable Doubt, a factual story in which a simple man was framed for murder in a grotesque and famous miscarriage of justice.
It was wrapped in wire, which had obviously been used to attach the axle. Now, these wire samples, which match that wire, were found on your farm.
Is that right?
And yet you tell me that you were at home on the night of the 17th of June, 1970.
Yeah, that's right.
So you see, I'm worried.
Bloody hell, I'm not surprised.
The thought occurs, could the depiction of authority as violent, corrupt, or foolish in New Zealand films ultimately be a kind of artist's revenge?
Stop! No, don't stop! But that's it! No, it's not! Listen to me! Where's my hat? I've got to have my hat! Is that cop pulling out?
No. Oh, yes, he is.
Why do I bother?
Better catch up a bit, eh?
Yeah, then we'll be able to try this thing out on him.
What happened to it?
I don't know.
Here's something excellent from today's paper. The days of portraying a laughing policeman are over for New Zealand movie makers. Police will not lend out uniforms to actors for comedy scripts.
Police Media Services Coordinator Joe Franklin said the decision was
the patriarch,
That's for you, Myrtle! Mother, where's the police? Come here!
to disobey is to incur the harshest penalties.
Monique? We'll hit the bloody lot of them!
It's okay, man. Cook the man some fucking eggs.
Sort yourself, Jake! Got the fucking slave around here, Jake!
With Sleeping Dogs, the film industry was up and running. I was off too, overseas. When I watch films, it's often for the sheer joy of watching other actors at work. But more than that, I put the case that a national cinema gains its distinctiveness as much by its performers as by its auteurs.
Knew Vera, did you? I was her brother.
Here's the great Ian Watkin, for example, responsible for a whole gallery of likeable grotesques.
Yeah. I'll be needing a few stiff drinks after this. Would you, care to join me? You look like you could do with a bit of a stiff one yourself.
¿Sabes qué te digo? Que vete a la mierda, déjame en paz, gilipollas.
Fiery.
You've all heard of Lord Haw-Haw.
Martin Sanderson, usually a crusty individualist.
He had a telegram from Goebbels with a message. And it said, tell Stan he can hold the South Island. I'll send one more joker to take the North. Only trouble is they can't find a single bugger with the guts to deliver it.
Kerry Fox.
You loved his dad.
No. No, I didn't love him. I liked him. He was gentle, he was kind, he was a good doctor. I probably would have married him. But I never loved him.
The tender, comic Grant Tilley.
Lost?
Here with his dead father.
Gully, it's dark. I hear you're coming to find me, and all you can say is bloody useless. When
Who?
John Bache, often a trifle deranged.
Hey, listen. Oh, ow. Ooh, listen. Hey, I'm on your side, eh? Do we want him on our side? Hey,
Well, he doesn't look like a cop.
are you a cop? Am I a cop? Oh, come on, man. That's heavy. No, listen, I just want to help you, eh? Yeah, he wants to help us. Oh, will you stop it?
And of course, Bruno Lawrence, the archetypal man apart.
All right. Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?
Where is he? If you don't come out, I'll shoot the kid.
Are you going to let me in so we can talk quietly about this or not?
No.
Bruno plays the definitive man alone in Smash Palace, Roger Donaldson's second feature. As the archetypal New Zealand boy's own film, its plot is a template for the genre. Bloke has trouble with wife, bloke leaves home. Bloke has trouble with police. Bloke resorts to violence.
Alan! Alan, what are you doing? Alan! Oh, Alan!
Well, there's a B-movie sound to this.
Like you say, Groucho, nothing half-assed!
And this was the Bible, the boy's own book, John Mulgan's Man Alone.
It is not the best book ever written in New Zealand, certainly the most influential. No other work had such a profound effect. None of us had actually read it. Minor detail. It tells the story of a man on the run, rejecting of and rejected by society.
Stop! Told you to stop!
This theme occurs time and time again in these early films.
You going to kill me?
Arguably, the best of these is Bad Blood, based on the true story of Stan Graham.
Cut it out, Stan.
The outsider, pushed too far by what he considers excessive pressure from society, takes violent recourse and pays with his life.
In the holidays, I've always come down here to Otago. And out here on the peninsula, I sometimes go fishing for salmon down on the rocks there. And early in the morning, coming down that road, looking at this impossibly high horizon, surrounded as one is by the curvature of the earth, I've often had the feeling that perhaps this is the edge of the world, and maybe these narrow islands really are adrift, and we may all just topple over the edge into oblivion.
This sense of the precarious is something one often feels in New Zealand films. A feeling that something awful is about to begin.
It happened. The same night our fowls were stolen, Daphne Moran had her throat cut.
However, we grew up here in the God-given certainty that nothing dramatic would ever happen to us, except perhaps you might go mad. Over there's a little place called Aramoana. It's too tiny to be even called a village. And in the 70s, something dramatic almost happened there. The government wanted to build a giant aluminium smelter, but by protest they were stopped and that beautiful little place was saved. And then in the 90s, something unspeakable did happen there.
It's a waiting game in the small settlement of Aramoana between armed police and the gunman who may have shot dead 8 people. The rampage began 16 hours ago, and although only 2 people are confirmed dead, residents of the village say bodies are scattered on the ground and it's not clear whether they're dead or alive.
One summer's day, a 33-year-old gun enthusiast took his AK-47 on a shooting spree, killing no less than 13 entirely innocent people. There's something about the horror of Aramoana that is sickeningly reminiscent of Bad Blood, the misfit turned psychopath. This was the madness made actual. could only be taken so far. The cinema was growing up. New filmmakers were emerging, new themes. The boys' film was under attack.
It was under attack from those that failed to include. New themes and new filmmakers were emerging. It was time to move on to the A feature.
Vincent Ward showed the way more than any other. His is a dark, personal vision. He struggled to bring a high sense of purpose to his work, and for New Zealand, a novel hint of the art house.
The irritating thing about a place like New Zealand is you leave because it drives you nuts and it's never going to change, and then when you come back, it's the list goes on and on. Some change, however, has been more encouraging. We now have a more independent foreign policy, including a nuclear-free policy. There's a Maori Renaissance. And we have, I think, a developing sense of where we are and who we are. We live in Polynesia. What I perceive to be a cultural renaissance. And in the middle of this is film. Cinema from New Zealand has found success overseas and a huge audience at home. It's a very exciting change.
In the last 2 or 3 years, a number of outstanding films have radically transformed not only New Zealand cinema, but also our perceptions of ourselves. Jane Campion brought me back to work on the piano. It felt good to be working at home. From the start, we were aware we were working on something extraordinary, and it was. Romantic, Gothic, unique.
Shall we stop? Tell you what.
The piano raised for me, however, the intriguing but worrying thought, if a national cinema is a reflection of ourselves, the film has been a social phenomenon. 1 in 3 New Zealanders has seen it to date.
Telling me in my own house who I can and can't have here. Well, I've asked them back tonight, and you better be ready for it. Do you hear me?
It is shocking and confronting, and also strangely inspiring.
Oh, great. Oh, leave that kid alone. You know, that's your problem. You spoiled a lot of them. No one else so fucking screwed up.
It's got nothing to do with you, AJ Kiki. You're such good father material. You chase Stig off. You couldn't give a damn about Boogie.
You're not gonna hurt my babies anymore. Not while I can do something about it. Oh, you want something to eat? You know how to cook.
Also inspirational are 2 films by and about women, Bread and Roses and An Angel at My Table.
I know. They want you to stand for me.
Don't.
No. Not yet.
Charlie! I'm pregnant.
In Bread and Roses, I'm touched by its acknowledgement of the ordinariness of the people portrayed. Implicit is the idea that we are all worthwhile in spite of, or perhaps because of, our New Zealandness.
bloody waste of time. Sit! You got a rehab loan?
Hope so.
Well, you need more than hope, mate. With this bloody Labour government, geez, you can't trust them. I mean, they're run by the trade unions. They'll have us all singing the red flag soon. And
I'm also touched by the note of optimism in both An Angel at My Table and Bread and Roses that allows for the possibility of love.
Well, good morning.
I brought some breakfast.
It's difficult to explain how moved I was when I first saw An Angel at My Table. It seemed miraculous, a masterpiece from our own place. The Chums Club was dead, the Jaffa reduced to a mere confection, the cultural cringe was no more.
An Angel at My Table explores with great effect the dilemma of the troubled adolescent, a theme that recurs again and again in our
Let's get you out of
films.
that nicely. I suppose you've mucked the sheets up as well.
In Heavenly Creatures, innocence is lost with ghastly, murderous consequences. The film is funny, scary, and quirky. And some think it may be the best film made in New Zealand to date.
I know what to do about Mother. We don't want to go to too much trouble. Some sort of accident.
The question I ask myself is, does a resonance remain? Is soil forever stained by blood? All these new films are very different. What they have in common is that they're dark, energetic, and very confident. And I love them. You may have noticed that the road is gone. Just as well, I suppose. Still, I rather miss it.
The filmmaker's own road is no longer a lonely one. Instead of indifference on all sides, there is approval and enthusiasm. New Zealanders now can not only see their place on the screen, they are there themselves, center frame. Eventually, as always, the time comes to leave. My first flight was years ago, but I continued to return like a migratory bird. What I found this time back is a uniquely strange and dark film industry.
West. Roger Donaldson, Jeff Murphy, Jane Campion, Vincent Ward, and so on.
They're exiles of a different kind.
But what I want to know is, when they dream of home, what do they see?
At the moment, there are 4 more New Zealand feature films in production. Once Were Warriors, the biggest grossing film in New Zealand box office history, will be screening on TV3 next year. Next week, we bring you the first program and an encore on the most popular documentaries screened during our last 2 seasons of Inside New Zealand. In the first part of a 2-part program,